Hello and welcome to episode 154 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz, and we've got another special episode. Any of the other news that has happened in the last week will have to wait yet again.
It'll have to wait. Last week, exactly. There's still a lot to cover. Last week, we took a look at kind of the immediate airspace effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how that was affecting commercial aviation, where aircraft could and could not fly, and all of the changes that were happening to airlines routing around Russia, where Russian airlines were being forced to stop flying, and kind of what was happening in the air. This week, to help us get us some perspective on the rapid tectonic changes that are happening to the aviation industry writ large, we have Jon Ostrower, the Air Currents editor, back once again. Jon, thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure. Good to be back with you guys.
So last week we talked with John Walton about where airplanes could and could not fly and the restrictions that were coming into force on the airspace and kind of some of the international regulations around where aircraft could fly. This week, I thought we could focus our conversation on the geopolitical and the aviation business side of things. And I think the biggest conversation that we can have right now is about the 500 aircraft that are effectively taken by Russian airlines against the wishes of their owners.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the leasing business has become as global and as influential as it is because of effectively, look, it's cheaper to lease an airplane, essentially rent an airplane, if you're an airline, to get rolling quickly. Someone has an inventory of airplanes that they want to get you, and they whether they're new or used, they can get them to you quickly and you can add capacity. And it's a great way to run an airline. That has been enabled by a lot of international agreements. The most notable one here is the Cape Town Convention, where Russia is a signatory, the US is a signatory, Ireland is a signatory, Egypt is a signatory. A huge number of nations have effectively agreed to repatriate aircraft if they are recalled by their owners or that the leases are canceled. It's the foundation of international law, which has enabled the leasing industry to become about 40 to 50% of all aircraft deliveries from Boeing, Airbus, and Embraer and others. This whole situation for the industry completely turns the leasing business on its head. There was just an expectation that Russia, there was risk associated because it was Russia, but I don't think anyone could foresee that you'd have an event where effectively a neutron bomb would hit the fleet and it was all of a sudden gone. And certainly, given the behavior of the airlines in terms of trying to keep their airplanes after the leases have been canceled, looks like that may become a real possibility.
It seems like this was so unexpected that Airbus was actually delivering A350s to Aeroflot hours and just mere days up until the invasion of Ukraine, and then everything got turned upside down. So this really seems like it came out of nowhere.
I believe there was a 350 actually delivered on its delivery flight from Toulouse to Moscow. I believe it was 36 hours before Airbus came out and openly criticized the Russian government and said, we're going to do everything possible to preserve freedom, democracy, and whatever the cost is, we will bear that. But again, they had just literally hours before delivered a probably $150 million airplane to Aeroflot. Whether or not that went through a lessor is not clear. I should probably check on that, but it's entirely possible it did. Whether or not that lessor will see the airplane ever again, also an open question.
Yeah, I looked into it a little bit. I think that one might actually be directly owned. I couldn't find any lessor information, but Aeroflot does also have a number of yet to be delivered A350s sitting at Toulouse right now. So I'm assuming those aircraft will be looking for new owners in the very near future.
And absolutely. And look, and this is not exactly a golden hour for large wide body commercial aircraft, given the state of the world and the kind of ups and downs of the pandemic recovery. So it's going to be interesting to see how that one plays out in its own right.
So what happens, assuming for the sake of argument that very few or perhaps even none of the aircraft leased by Russian airlines are returned to their lessors. What is the legal status of these aircraft?
That is a great question. And because that is actually exactly what the leasing industry is speculating on right now, because there's the academic discussion and there's the actual discussion. And so right now, I believe they've recovered, I think less than half a dozen that we know about of these 515 airplanes. I'm aware that there are others that are probably being teed up for repossession, which are among smaller carriers, some smaller freighters that might be coming out of the system. That is yet to be seen, but there's, I think, a bit more cooperation on some other corners. So it's not going to be all 500 plus, but it's going to be a very, very, very significant number. So what happens to those? In the insurance industry, it's called a constructive total loss. It's the asset is gone. And so in theory, the lessors would be paid out by the insurance companies for the book value of the asset. And some of these airplanes are really new, like really, really new. Russia's been on a heavy tear on fleet modernization with 320neos and 350s and 777s that are factory fresh. And so there's a lot of really brand new airplanes in the mix. It's a huge number, and it's definitely in the billions. Given what the exposure is. I think AirCap, which is the largest lessor in the world, it's become the largest lessor through a combination of mergers and acquisitions. They were first with ILFC, and then more recently with GCAS as they exited the leasing business. So they become the big player there, and they have a portfolio of about 150 or so, 140 something airplanes in Russia. And whether or not they see them again is a huge, huge, huge open question. Not just, hey, are we going to see these again, but will insurance cover them? And oh, by the way, did you insure it? Is the number the actual book value of the airplane? Or did they quite cleverly insure also the lost revenues that come with the loss of that asset? And there's a possibility that they actually may have. So this number gets considerably larger if that ends up being the case. So I know there are a lot of actuaries who are probably existing solely on a diet of Tums in the last week, trying to answer this question.
That's pretty incredible. So there are aircraft out there that could be flying for realistically decades to come that might be written off as a total loss in 2022. That's kind of insane to think about that.
Look, this is what happens. This is a casualty of economic warfare. People said that a new Iron Curtain is coming around Russia. Given the disconnection to Western industry, to essentially operating in the system that they have enjoyed for the last 20 to 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And look, I would just note, I think this is important. On the industry side, we get to have this discussion, and it is a luxury. I mean, this is sort of the downstream sort of discussion around aircraft operations and the leasing industry and insurance dollars and disruption around civil aerospace. And that is a luxury, compared to how lucky we are and how fortunate we are to be able to have that conversation relative to the fact that there are people who are in incredible harm's way and are dying under this invasion. And I think it's important to put that into the right perspective. But certainly with that in mind, thinking about the economic effect broadly, I think is to a lesser importance, but of a significant one as well.
Yeah, I don't think, and we talked a little bit about this last week too, in our discussion about the airspace. There are so many other things that are so much more immediate and important, but we're still going to sit here and analyze and talk because this is what we know and this is what we do. And to jump into not even another lane, but across many, many highways to have a separate discussion, I want to leave that to people who really know what they're talking about. And so that when people come here, they get good information about the things that we know about for sure.
The craziest part of all this is because this is a form of economic warfare that we're witnessing. And it's the West's response to this action. And it's kind of crazy from my personal perspective. I back in college, my senior thesis was about how nations use civil aviation as an extension of national image. And one big part of my thesis really focused on how a denial of aviation was part of that as well. And, going back to, how Nazi Germany used the Zeppelin as a symbol of advanced technology. Most recently, we saw when that Ryanair flight was effectively hijacked by Belarus to arrest a journalist, the first penalty that befell Belarus was against their airlines. They would not be allowed to fly into the EU. So we see this sort of that aviation is so intertwined with nations and geopolitics and national image, and denial of that is so key to understanding saying, no, you cannot be a part of the modern world. And that's what we're witnessing right now from a geopolitical perspective, from a sociological perspective, from an economic perspective. And I think it certainly writes an entirely new chapter on the scale at which aviation is interconnected within modern life, and how taking it away has a tremendous effect on a society.
Yeah, and on that same topic, since we spoke last week with John Walton, Aeroflot and really all the Russian airlines have they have become domestic operating only airlines. They can no longer even operate internationally, I guess, without the risk of the airplanes being repossessed. And John, can you take us through a little bit about what would happen potentially if Aeroflot or one of the other Russian airlines were to try to operate internationally at this point?
Yeah, so Aeroflot killed its international network on the 8th of March. That came about a week after the repossessions started, or attempted repossessions. And I stress attempted. We had a piece on the Air Current a couple of days ago about a failed repo operation in Cairo. And it was a 10-month-old Airbus A321neo flying from Moscow to Cairo. And the airplane, as it's flying en route to Egypt, it's over Georgia, the former Soviet Republic, Aeroflot was served papers effectively saying your airplane is being repossessed and the certificate of airworthiness has been revoked along with the insurance. That airplane at that point needed to be, legally speaking, based on its registration in Bermuda. By the way, there's another nation involved in this too. This is a Japanese bank that operates an Irish lessor with a Russian airplane that's on the Bermudan register. So it's a multi-nation affair, as the aviation business has always been. And so the airplane lands. Based on our reporting, and it's not clear exactly what happened on the ground, but that the Egyptian authorities declined or just looked the other way, or we're not exactly sure what happened, but we understand that Egypt, with the full knowledge that this airplane was in contravention of its civil aviation regulations, was allowed to refuel, push back, and return to Moscow. And it flew, potentially with passengers. We're not 100% sure about that. It flew with no insurance and no certificate of airworthiness. And that's a paperwork issue, fundamentally. But it is, again, in abject contravention to the standards and norms that we've come to know in aviation, and why the system is as safe as it is. And it's just incredibly shocking.
Well, and one of the big things that makes civil aviation different than so many other industries is the fact that, for the most part, everyone plays by the same rules. Even, when you're talking about countries that may have less stellar safety records, the rules are still the same. How to maintain the aircraft are still the same, whether the aircraft is in northern Canada, southern Argentina, Antarctica, Russia. It doesn't matter where. I mean, the maintenance, the care, the paperwork, that's all supposed to be the same, so that you can take these aircraft from one place to another, because that's what they're designed to do, and have them be safe no matter where they take off and where they land. So to do that, I mean, I get the geopolitical impulse and the national interest impulse on behalf of Aeroflot. I don't think I'm saying that excuses it in the least.
Yeah, the interesting thing is kind of getting into the mind of the Egyptian authorities in this one. And, I think it's twofold. And again, I will fully admit this is speculative, but I think that given the importance of Russian tourists to Egypt, I think not running afoul of that flow of people, I think was certainly a thought process. I think there's also they also have, I think, 24 Su-35 fighters on order with Sukhoi. And so there are a lot of different moving parts to this. And do you want to get into a big fight over a $50 million asset when you're talking about a multi-billion dollar fighter deal and a huge part of your tourist economy? But at the same time, it also goes to show you that, look, Egypt is a signatory to Cape Town, and they are obligated to repossess an airplane if the lease is canceled and the certificate of airworthiness is canceled. Period. That airplane should not be allowed to fly. But as this whole situation has shown us, international law is a thing you do when it's convenient. When it flies in the face of sovereign self-interest, it's a heck of a lot more flexible than it is hard and fast. And that's a very troubling development in its own right in terms of an international system that I think the world has sought to create for a 21st century that is inherently massively more interconnected and interdependent on itself.
So let's continue on that thread of interdependence. All of these aircraft, especially the new aircraft, and we talked a little bit about this last week, they're basically large, aerodynamically shaped flying computers. And there are so many services beyond being able to get physical parts for these aircraft. I mean, we talked about Boeing turning off charts for operators. We've talked about Aeroflot losing access to their ticket sales and the GDS, but they've also got all of these other service, electronic services that go into flying, dispatching, preparing these aircraft. How long can Russian airlines continue to operate without access to these, and then kind of getting into the spare parts process? How long can they keep going?
Yeah. It's interesting. So we talked about how aviation's been used as a weapon of economic warfare and denial of access to aviation. You go back to 1979 after the Iranian Revolution and the overthrow of the Shah and what happened to Iran Air. And it operated, or has operated, consistently ever since, effectively earning itself the reputation as one of the most unsafe markets in the world, given the fact that the fleet is held together with, bubblegum and baling wire to some extent because of the embargo that prevented them from getting aircraft parts. There was a brief window during the Obama administration after the JCPOA agreement that allowed Iran to get airplane parts, and they took as many airplanes as they possibly could in a very short period of time. Principally, I think a couple of A330s and some ATR 72s, I believe. And it was the first new aircraft to be delivered to Iran in ages. And then the Trump administration rolls around, and that got roundly put on the back burner, and the pipeline closed off again. But they made it work. They made it work. They had 747 SPs that were flying, well into the last decade. They're 30-plus-year-old airplanes, and they had A300s going for ages. And then they got a bunch of airplanes secondhand, which they've sort of been able to cannibalize and figure out a black market for parts to make it work. The interesting thing about where we see the Russian situation, this is more of a question than anything I can put my hands on at this moment. If you have a 787 or a 350, and actually there are no 787s operating in Russia, but if you have an A350 flying in the Russian fleet, when you took delivery of that airplane, did Airbus send along a paper copy of the manuals? I'm willing to bet that all of the maintenance documentation and all of the appropriate training systems are probably digital. And were they digital in terms of direct delivery, or were they accessed through a cloud portal? And what is the status of that? These are questions that I have. And do they even have access to the documentation to take care of these incredibly advanced, complex airplanes? It's a small number of airplanes in the mix, but I think it just goes to show you how much airplane maintenance has changed over the years, moving away from a paper process and all that. But you've got a ton of 737s and A320s that you can probably find the documentation on. And I would imagine the Russian aviation industry has been massively underfunded and held together with bubblegum and baling wire before, and that was right after the Soviet Union fell. And so this is a return to that in a lot of ways. I mean, there's talk of cannibalizing a lot of, 2 airplanes for every 1 airplane that will keep flying. And by the way, if you start cannibalizing those airplanes, you can bet that they will never ever re-enter the global fleet, not just because of the questionable sort of whatever storage or love and care they're getting as part of this cannibalization, but also the records that go with them. And that's even if the lessors can actually get access to them again. And by the way, that's a question of whether or not they'll be able to even do business in Russia to be able to take them back. It's at any point in the future. So, look, this is a business that runs on information and paperwork. And certainly Iran showed us that you can have a struggling but operational airline for many decades based on black market of parts, internal repairs done yourself, and whatever spares are in country right now. It's not going to be, they're not going to all fall apart in 3 weeks, but it's going to happen fairly rapidly as far as how usable these aircraft are over the next 3, 6, 12 months. The operating fleet is going to get very, very small very, very quickly.
Well, and thinking about the effect on airlines like Aeroflot, where basically a state airline, heavily state supported, versus some of the smaller Russian airlines that might not be as well supported, where even if they, had the inclination to say, okay, here are the planes back and getting planes the next time we can get planes, that's obviously not going to happen. Thinking about what those airlines do, they're going to be much more heavily affected much more quickly.
Absolutely. I think, I guess the question is, does Russia nationalize the fleet? And do you then nationalize aspects of the industry itself to maintain a domestic network where effectively you say, well, this is whatever the Russian equivalent of EAS is, essential air service for various communities, that if a small airline doesn't operate it, Aeroflot will step in because guess what? You also have the capacity that you were using overseas no longer available for that, or no longer have access to that, used on domestic operations. I mean, it's so interesting because the Russian domestic market is enormous. It was actually one of the most vibrant sort of post-pandemic bright spots. They were actually above their 2019 traffic last summer.
Yeah,
domestically.
Yeah, and they reached it rather quickly. I mean, comparatively speaking, they were I think, if not one of the first to have a domestic market that was above pre-pandemic levels. And when I first saw those numbers, I was like, oh, that's incredible. And then you look at the growth, and we touched on this kind of at the beginning of our conversation, how new these aircraft are. These airlines have grown incredibly quickly. And very recently, they've grown incredibly quickly and developed a lot of capacity. And now all of that, basically all of the wide body capacity, nearly all of the wide body capacity is useless.
Well, it's also geographically a massive country. Some of these domestic flights, they're 8 hours and actually require some of these wide body aircraft. Moscow to Vladivostok is a solid 8 hours eastbound. So yeah, there are some routes that actually require these wide bodies, but by and large, you're going to have quite the surplus.
I mean, you're going to see, for the next couple of weeks, a 350 on the St. Petersburg Moscow route.
Well, look, we had LA to Dallas on no 777s.
Yeah, there's something to be said. There's something to be said for that.
Similar, but not the same.
Right?
Yeah. As I kind of play 5-dimensional chess around this in my own head, I do wonder, Russian aerospace is not without its ability to be self-sufficient. There are extreme weaknesses in that self-sufficiency, but it's important to note that they have a long aviation history, a long operational history, a long history of being incredibly resourceful with very few resources. And at a time when the ability to actually design your own airplane is becoming a marginally more viable option. We had the MC-21, the Irkut MC-21, which is about the same size as a 737-900 and an A321-ish sized airplane. That just got certified by the Russian authorities at the end of December. It notably was certified with Pratt & Whitney engines, which are not going to be going into Russia anymore. And the Dubai Air Show in November, the aircraft they had there was called the MC-21 310. And the 310, the 10 in particular, signifies that it was an aircraft that had Russian engines. It's called, the engine called the PD-14, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the manufacturer of it because I will butcher it terribly. But it's a Russian manufacturer under the United Engine Corporation brand, which kind of consolidated their operations, and it's effectively a LEAP 1B CFM LEAP 1B engine, sort of geared turbofan generation technology engine made in Russia, and it's going to take them a long time to get up to any kind of rate with that. But that airplane, the 310, was a direct response to sanctions that started back in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, when the Obama administration started putting restrictions on this. And that in turn caused them to have to essentially uncouple from Western manufacturers that helped bring these airplanes to life. I mean, we with this incredible era of openness for the first 15 years of the century, where you had China, Russia, and Europe, the United States, and Brazil and Canada working in those markets to bring those airplanes to life for the benefit of all commercial aviation. That's over now.
So let's take that as a pivot to discuss some of the effects on the OEMs themselves, thinking about, Airbus, Boeing, Embraer selling, designing, manufacturing aircraft with either Russian material or Russian personnel. And then, kind of stepping back to, we mentioned Pratt & Whitney already they were going to engine the MC-21. You have all of these other engine makers, Rolls, you've got CFM, all of these engine makers that now can't send engines into Russia. How do the sanctions on Russia start to affect those companies?
Yeah. So one of the big pieces of this is is actually one of the biggest pieces of the Russian economy, which is their export of raw materials, in particular titanium and nickel. Titanium is a major part of large composite airplanes like the 350 and the 787, principally because of its ability to expand and contract in the same ways that carbon fiber does with different temperatures. It also prevents galvanic corrosion, which is corrosion that happens when you put two materials next to each other, and if electric current is created, will actually begin to cause corrosion. And that happens when you put aluminum and carbon fiber next to each other. So titanium is a major ingredient there. It's in fasteners, it's in landing gear, it's in engine casings. That those huge beams you see in landing gear are typically made from titanium, and the engine casings also titanium. I mean, it plays a huge role in the manufacture of airplanes. So by the numbers, Russia provides about 35% of Boeing's titanium, about 60+% of Airbus's, and 100% of Embraer's. And so the need to have access to that titanium, which goes through a company called VSMPO Avisma, which is a state-owned Russian company that does everything from taking the titanium ore and turning it into titanium sponge, and then the whole process of getting that through the industrial chain to a finished milled or rolled or finalized product to go on an airplane. And so the key part of that, of course, is the finished piece of it, because there's an industrial component to that in terms of the presses that are actually used in that process, which should be qualified and certified, which are hard to come by, and it takes a while to switch. If there is one silver lining that has come from the pandemic, it's that Boeing and Airbus massively decreased the rate of production of their wide-body aircraft like the 350 and the 787. And in doing so, because of the long lead times for these parts, what you had was in December of 2019, the combined rate was somewhere between 24 and 25-ish airplanes per month between Boeing and Airbus with the 350 and the 787. Well, they slammed on the brakes when the pandemic hit. And the catch up in the supply chain, particularly on the titanium front, allowed them to actually build up a huge buffer as the train cars piled up behind them, effectively. And so that was even after Boeing started an effort to stockpile titanium after the initial round of sanctions in 2014. So Boeing has a considerable stockpile of titanium. Airbus does too. Boeing actually announced that they are going to be they're suspending purchases of Russian titanium, which is a very big deal, which number one says how confident they are in their stockpile and that they can do this. They actually have a joint venture, a 50-50 joint venture with VSMPO, which they re-upped in November, which has been a huge part of their operation across all their airplanes. Airbus has not stopped purchasing titanium from Russia. I think that's notable and something that we need to watch. But Embraer also continues. However, they do have a buffer there as well for the E-jets. One thing that we saw yesterday, so yesterday is March 8th, is the Kremlin came out and said it's going to be restricting some products and raw material, the export of those materials. We don't know what that means yet. It was a very vague announcement from the Kremlin, which sent everyone in the aerospace industry, sort of poking their heads up being like, okay, tell me more. And the Kremlin has promised, I think they said within 2 to 3 days, they would actually have a list of restricted products that weren't allowed to leave the country for national security reasons. Is that titanium? We don't know. There's a lot of folks who think it probably will be. If it is, the biggest effect is not going to be on the airframers. It's probably going to be on guys like the engine makers who rely heavily on the titanium. Safran and CFM rely heavily on Russian titanium for components within the LEAP engine, for example, which again is accelerating production right now, given the need for single aisle airplanes at both Boeing and Airbus. They share an engine. Pratt & Whitney, of course, is on the Embraer E2, the A220, and the A320 family at Airbus. And so we see these dynamics play out, but it is a huge, huge, huge watch item right now for the industry that, look, there was already going to be a supply chain crunch as the rates went up, given all of the disruption from the pandemic and working capital and staffing and the ability to do this and actually provide those parts. So it was going to be rough before. We're going to see if Vladimir Putin really does have the ability to shut down the aerospace industry as something he actually does.
That was a very thorough explanation of why I'm a little depressed about the future of aviation right now. It goes to how interconnected everything truly is. I mean, we talk about, flying being the actual travel of people to places being the thing that connects, but it starts long, long before the plane ever leaves the ground. I mean, when you start talking about how these individual components, may or may not be accessible, I mean, is there a way to pick up the slack?
In theory, I think we're gonna find out. Certainly these buffers give a little bit of breathing room. There is domestic, and I say domestic, U.S. domestic production of a lot of these parts, and then the capabilities there. Notably, at the other end of the spectrum, not like the actual finalization for production, but like the actual processing of the raw materials, the U.S. actually closed its last titanium sponge production facility a couple years back. And I think it was just before the pandemic. It was in Henderson, Nevada, and that's over now. And so the U.S. has been relying heavily on places like Japan for that capability. Whether we see them get back in the game, I think we're going to find out in due course. I would imagine they probably will, given the strategic capability. And there was actually a request of the U.S. government to subsidize it, to keep it open as a strategic technology. And the government actually declined. And so the facility closed. But I think you're going to see, supply chains going forward, particularly designed, look, after the pandemic, for sure. But now we see this sort of fracturing of the global industry, which says the supply chains need to be just built in a different, more resilient way, given the fact that this is not a market you're going to have access to either as a consumer to fly to, or a lessor to lease to, or a manufacturer to sell to, or source parts from. And that's a different way to think about aviation, where after this decade and a half or longer of incredible openness that we really enjoyed. And that's a honest to God tragedy, because it meant that we would be together. We would be able to travel together. And the core, coming back full circle here. I talked about what I wrote back in college, my senior thesis, was the idea that travel is the last 3 feet, as Edward R. Murrow said. It's the ability to shake someone's hand and look them in the eye. And that was what was so hard about the pandemic, because we were all so separate. And this is just another reinforcement of that separateness that that in the past allowed us to be together, and where you weren't relying on, Twitter messages or social media or TV or movies or whatever to understand another culture. You went there and you talked to people and you saw it with your own two eyes. And that incredible openness that we enjoyed in aviation over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, for at least the foreseeable future, is over.
I don't think that we can go anywhere from there, so I think that's where we should leave it. Not a rosy picture by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly where we are now. We've been joined this week by Jon Ostrower. He's the editor-in-chief of the Air Current. Jon, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure, guys. Hey,
thank you, Jon.
Raise the glass to the future. Better days will be ahead.
Indeed. This has been episode 154 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick here, as always, with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.